Monsters are rarely the ones who frighten us the most. Sometimes, it is the silence surrounding them. The winter wind swept across Blackstone Keep with a bitter edge that slipped beneath cloaks and stung every uncovered hand and face. Snow drifted through the enormous courtyard in slow spirals, settling over banners embroidered with silver wolves and ancient crowns. Hundreds of werewolves stood shoulder to shoulder beneath the gray afternoon sky, their eyes fixed on the massive iron gates that had remained closed since dawn. No one spoke above a whisper. Even the restless children who usually chased one another through the square clung tightly to their parents, sensing the strange tension that hung over the kingdom like an approaching storm. They had all heard the same stories. They had all grown up with the same warnings. Never look directly into the Alpha King's eyes. Never question his commands. Never mistake his silence for kindness. King Kieran Ashford had ruled the Northern Territories for nearly a decade, and every tale painted him as a man carved from winter itself. Victories followed wherever he marched, yet celebrations never followed him home. He inspired loyalty, respect, and fear in equal measure, but almost no one claimed to understand the lonely ruler behind the silver crown. When the first horn echoed across the valley, every conversation died at once. The gates groaned open slowly, revealing the royal procession returning from the frozen frontier. Soldiers entered first, their armor dusted with snow, their expressions disciplined and unreadable. Behind them came enormous gray wolves pulling supply wagons through the thick slush. Finally, the courtyard seemed to stop breathing altogether as a towering black wolf stepped through the gate before shifting effortlessly into the form of a man. Kieran Ashford stood well over 6 feet tall, his dark hair brushed by the wind, while countless pale scars crossed his broad shoulders and strong arms like faded memories written into his skin. His heavy cloak had been lost somewhere beyond the mountains, leaving only dark trousers and worn leather boots against the relentless cold. He appeared completely unaware of the freezing air. His silver eyes remained fixed ahead with calm determination, carrying the weight of countless responsibilities rather than anger. Yet no one dared move. Servants lowered their heads. Noble families stepped backward without being told. Even experienced warriors avoided standing too close. Fear had become such an ordinary part of greeting their king that none of them questioned it anymore. Hidden near the back of the crowd stood Emily Carter, a tiny Omega barely 20 years old, wrapped in an old cream-colored wool blanket her late grandmother had stitched by hand years before. She had arrived that morning to deliver baskets of dried herbs from the village healers, hoping to leave before anyone important noticed her. Instead, she found herself trapped among hundreds of spectators watching history unfold. Emily had expected to see a terrifying monster. That was what everyone described whenever the king's name was spoken. But the man standing before her looked nothing like the stories. He looked exhausted. Snowflakes landed quietly against his uncovered shoulders before melting away almost instantly. A faint cloud escaped his lips each time he breathed into the icy air. For just a heartbeat, beneath the strength that filled the courtyard, Emily thought she saw something else. Not weakness, not pain, simply a man carrying more weight than anyone should ever carry alone. Her fingers tightened around the edge of her blanket. Around her, whispers floated like drifting snow. Don't stare. Keep your head down. He doesn't need anyone. Emily tried to obey. She lowered her gaze exactly as everyone else did. But something inside her refused to believe that kindness should disappear simply because someone wore a crown. Slowly, almost without realizing it herself, she looked back toward the silent king once more, and her heart made a decision before her mind ever had the chance to stop it. Emily could hear her own heartbeat louder than the winter wind. It echoed inside her ears as her fingers slowly loosened their grip on the faded cream-colored blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Every lesson she had learned since childhood warned her to stay exactly where she was. An Omega did not step toward an Alpha King. An insignificant village girl certainly did not approach the ruler of the Northern Territories in the middle of a royal procession. Yet every time another icy gust swept through the courtyard, she noticed the fine layer of snow collecting across Kieran Ashford's scarred shoulders before quietly melting away. The sight unsettled her in a way she could not explain. He was the strongest man anyone had ever known, but strength had never made someone immune to the cold. Emily swallowed nervously and took one careful step forward. then another. The crowd noticed immediately. A woman beside her reached for Emily's sleeve, her frightened whisper barely louder than the wind. "Do not do this." Emily hesitated only long enough to offer the woman a small apologetic smile before continuing. The distance between herself and the king seemed impossibly long, though it could not have been more than 30 feet. Each step felt heavier than the last. Hundreds of eyes followed the tiny Omega crossing the open courtyard while no one else dared move. Members of the royal guard exchanged uncertain glances but remained perfectly still. None of them had ever received instructions for something like this. Emily could barely feel her legs anymore. Her cheeks flushed a deep shade of pink as embarrassment flooded through her. She was painfully aware that everyone was staring. She wished she could disappear beneath the snow. Still, she kept walking until she stood only a few feet away from the silent king. Up close, Kieran seemed even taller than she had imagined. His presence filled the cold air without effort, yet it was not anger she sensed. It was stillness, a quiet that felt older than the mountains surrounding Blackstone Keep. He slowly lowered his silver eyes toward her. Emily forgot every sentence she had planned inside her head. The words vanished completely. She could only look down at the blanket in her trembling hands before taking one careful breath. Without asking permission, without speaking, she gently lifted the blanket and settled it across his broad shoulders. Her fingertips brushed the rough edge of the worn fabric as she carefully adjusted it so it rested evenly. She avoided touching him directly, keeping every movement respectful and gentle. The old wool carried the faint scent of cedarwood, lavender, and fresh bread from her grandmother's tiny cottage. For a long moment, absolutely nothing happened. The courtyard became so quiet that the distant call of ravens circling above the castle walls sounded startlingly loud. Emily immediately realized what she had done. Color rushed into her face. She lowered her eyes so quickly that a loose strand of chestnut hair slipped across her cheek. I am sorry," she whispered so softly that she almost could not hear herself. "You looked cold." A ripple of stunned disbelief spread through the crowd. Several nobles stared with open mouths. Others looked away entirely, unwilling to witness what they believed would surely follow. One elderly merchant quietly removed his hat and bowed his head as though preparing for a funeral. Emily heard none of their reactions clearly. She could think only of the unbearable silence standing in front of her. Kieran did not remove the blanket. He did not step away. Instead, his gaze rested quietly on the simple woven fabric draped across his shoulders. His fingers slowly reached upward, almost hesitantly, brushing against its familiar texture. The coarse wool should have felt ordinary. Instead, a gentle warmth spread through his hands, subtle enough that no one else could have noticed. For the first time in longer than he could remember, the endless pressure that usually lived deep inside his chest eased ever so slightly. It was not dramatic. It was not magical. It simply felt peaceful. The bitter edge of the winter air no longer seemed quite as sharp. A forgotten memory surfaced without warning. A much younger boy sitting beside a fireplace while gentle hands wrapped an oversized blanket around his shoulders after he had wandered outside during a snowstorm. His mother's quiet laughter. The scent of cedar burning in the hearth. The simple reassurance that someone had cared whether he was warm. The memory disappeared as quickly as it had come, but the feeling remained. Kieran looked back at the tiny Omega standing before him with lowered eyes, clearly expecting punishment instead of gratitude. She had not approached him because of power. She had not hoped for recognition. She had acted before fear could stop her. Around them, the entire kingdom seemed frozen in place, waiting for its king to speak. But Kieran remained silent, his hand resting lightly against the old blanket while snow continued to fall around them. And for reasons he could not yet understand, the lonely fortress that had always felt unbearably cold no longer seemed quite so empty. Emily wished the snow would swallow her whole. The silence that followed her whispered apology stretched so long that every heartbeat felt painfully loud inside her chest. She kept her eyes lowered, unable to gather the courage to look at the man standing before her. Around the courtyard, the first murmurs finally began to rise, soft at first, then spreading through the crowd like wind moving across frozen branches. No one could remember witnessing anything remotely similar. A tiny village Omega had walked directly to the Alpha King, covered his shoulders with her own blanket, and was still standing there unharmed. Noble women exchanged uneasy glances behind embroidered gloves. Merchants quietly stepped farther away, uncertain whether remaining nearby might somehow place them in danger. Even the palace servants, who had spent years learning every silent rule of royal life, looked completely lost. Captain Rowan Mercer, commander of the Royal Guard, instinctively took one step forward before stopping himself. His hand rested lightly against the hilt of his ceremonial sword, not from hostility, but from confusion. Throughout his 20 years of service, King Kieran Ashford had never allowed anyone to cross the invisible space surrounding him without permission. Yet the king had neither stepped away nor dismissed the young Omega. Rowan glanced toward the royal advisors standing beneath the stone balcony. None of them offered guidance. They were just as bewildered as everyone else. Emily slowly lifted her eyes, only for a brief moment, and immediately wished she had not. The Alpha King was still looking at her. There was nothing cold in his expression, yet there was something impossible to read, as though he had discovered a question he had never thought to ask before. Emily's cheeks warmed again. She quickly lowered her gaze, twisting her fingers together in front of her. "I truly did not mean any disrespect," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "My grandmother always said that no one should stand alone in the cold." The words escaped before she could stop them. Several nobles inhaled sharply. Mentioning family so casually before the king sounded almost improper to their ears. Emily immediately regretted speaking. She closed her mouth and waited for someone to escort her away. Instead, another quiet moment passed. Snowflakes drifted lazily between them, settling across the ancient stone beneath their feet. Kieran lowered his eyes to the old blanket once again. The careful stitches along one corner caught his attention. Tiny silver thread had been woven into the faded cream wool, forming the outline of a crescent moon surrounded by delicate pine branches. It was clearly handmade. Every uneven stitch revealed patience rather than perfection. Someone had created it with care instead of wealth. His fingertips traced the embroidered pattern almost absent-mindedly. The faint warmth lingering within the fabric remained, subtle but unmistakable. It reminded him of something his advisors had insisted no longer existed inside the royal court. Simple kindness without expectation. At the edge of the gathering, an elderly palace maid named Margaret quietly wiped a tear from the corner of her eye. She had served 3 generations of the royal family and remembered the late Queen Eleanor wrapping blankets around young servants whenever storms rolled through the mountains. For one impossible heartbeat, the courtyard no longer looked like a place ruled by fear. It looked almost human. The illusion broke when Lord Victor Hawthorne stepped forward from the line of advisors. Tall, impeccably dressed, and known throughout the kingdom for his strict devotion to tradition, he cleared his throat before bowing respectfully toward the king. "Your Majesty," he said carefully, "the journey has been long. The council has prepared today's reports, and the court awaits your arrival." His words were polite, but his sharp blue eyes lingered briefly on Emily with obvious concern. The unspoken message was clear. This strange interruption needed to end before rumors spread beyond the castle walls. Kieran did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked once more at the frightened Omega standing in front of him. She appeared ready to apologize another dozen times if necessary. She expected rejection because life had likely taught her to expect little else. That realization settled unexpectedly heavily inside him. Without raising his voice, he finally spoke, his calm tone carrying effortlessly across the silent courtyard. "What is your name?" The question landed with greater force than any royal decree. Emily blinked in surprise. For a second, she wondered whether she had imagined hearing it. Slowly, she looked up again. "Emily," she answered softly. "Emily Carter, Your Majesty." Kieran repeated the name almost thoughtfully, as though committing it to memory. Emily Carter. Hearing the Alpha King speak her name sent another wave of astonishment through the crowd. Whispers erupted once again, louder this time. No one could remember the last occasion when the king had asked an ordinary villager such a simple question. Emily remained perfectly still, unsure what came next. She expected an order, perhaps permission to leave, perhaps a formal warning never to approach him again. Instead, Kieran gave the smallest nod, one so subtle that many people wondered later whether they had imagined it. Then he turned toward the towering entrance of Blackstone, keep with the blanket still resting across his shoulders. As he walked forward, The royal guard instinctively followed. Advisors hurried after him. Servants scrambled into motion. Yet every person crossing the courtyard stole one last glance toward the tiny Omega left standing alone in the gently falling snow, because they all sensed the same impossible truth. Something had quietly changed that afternoon, and none of them understood how a single act of ordinary kindness had managed to alter the silence surrounding the loneliest king in the north. Emily remained where she stood long after the royal procession disappeared into Blackstone Keep. The snow continued falling gently around her, settling across the empty space where the king had been only moments before. She pulled her hands together to keep them warm and suddenly realized how light her shoulders felt without the familiar blanket she had owned for nearly 15 years. It had been her grandmother's final gift, stitched together from worn pieces of wool collected over many winters. She had never imagined leaving home without it, much less placing it upon the shoulders of the most powerful man in the Northern Territories. Around her, the crowd slowly began to disperse, but the whispers only grew louder. Every conversation carried her name. Some voices sounded amazed. Others sounded worried. A few insisted she had embarrassed herself beyond repair. Emily lowered her head and quietly gathered the empty herb baskets she had nearly forgotten. She hoped to slip away before anyone stopped her. Unfortunately, fate had other plans. Miss Carter. The calm voice behind her caused her footsteps to freeze. She turned slowly and found Captain Rowan Mercer approaching with measured steps, his silver cloak moving gently in the winter breeze. Several royal guards stood a respectful distance behind him, their expressions impossible to read. Emily's stomach tightened. She immediately bowed her head. "Captain," she whispered, "if I have broken a rule, I am truly sorry." Rowan studied the young woman for a long moment. She looked exactly as frightened as everyone expected after standing before the Alpha King. Yet there was no arrogance in her posture, no expectation of reward, only quiet sincerity. It reminded him of people he had not met in many years. "His Majesty requests your presence," Rowan said simply. Emily blinked in confusion. My presence." Immediately, her heart skipped so suddenly that she almost dropped the baskets again. Did I do something wrong?" Rowan's stern face softened just enough to become almost reassuring. "If you had, Miss Carter, I assure you this conversation would sound very different." Emily was not certain whether that answer comforted her. She followed the captain through the enormous castle gates while dozens of curious eyes watched from every direction. Servants paused in their work. Young apprentices leaned over stone railings above the courtyard. Palace guards standing watch exchanged brief glances as the tiny Omega disappeared into corridors usually reserved for nobles and diplomats. The castle felt far warmer inside than it had outside, though Emily still shivered. Towering stone columns stretched toward vaulted ceilings painted with constellations and silver wolves running beneath the moon. Massive fireplaces filled the corridors with the comforting scent of cedarwood. Portraits of kings and queens watched silently from golden frames as though observing every visitor. Emily had never imagined walking through such magnificent halls. Her worn leather boots sounded almost embarrassingly loud against the polished marble floor. She worried she might accidentally touch something valuable simply by breathing too closely. Rowan finally stopped before a pair of enormous oak doors carved with the royal crest. Two guards quietly stepped aside. Emily stared at the doors, suddenly wishing she could return to her tiny cottage where the only difficult decision each morning involved choosing which herbs to gather first. Rowan looked toward her. "Do not be afraid." Emily managed a nervous smile. "I have been afraid since breakfast." To Rowan's surprise, the faintest hint of amusement touched his usually serious expression. He opened one of the heavy doors and gestured for her to enter. The royal study was far quieter than she expected. Sunlight filtered through tall windows overlooking snow-covered mountains, filling the room with pale winter light. Shelves overflowing with old books lined every wall. Maps, letters, and carefully organized documents covered a broad wooden desk near the fireplace. Standing beside the window with his back partially turned was Kieran Ashford. He still wore the cream-colored blanket across his shoulders. Emily's eyes widened. She had assumed he would return it immediately after entering the castle. Instead, he had kept it. Hearing the doors close softly behind her, Kieran turned. The room remained silent for several moments. Emily lowered herself into a respectful curtsy, keeping her eyes fixed on the floor. Your Majesty. Kieran looked at the frightened young woman before him and noticed details the crowded courtyard had hidden. Her gloves had been repaired several times with different colored thread. Snow had melted into the edges of her boots. A loose strand of chestnut hair escaped the braid resting over one shoulder. Nothing about her suggested wealth or influence. Yet she had walked through an entire kingdom's fear to perform one simple act of kindness. Raise your head, Emily. She obeyed cautiously. His silver eyes remained calm, almost thoughtful. He rested one hand lightly against the folded edge of the blanket. You said your grandmother believed no one should stand alone in the cold. Emily nodded. Yes, Your Majesty. Was that why you approached me? She hesitated only briefly. No one else was moving. I thought. Perhaps everyone had forgotten that kings can become cold too. The answer lingered between them in complete silence. For the first time in many years, no court official, advisor, or nobleman filled the room with carefully chosen words. Only honesty remained, simple and unpolished. Kieran lowered his eyes for a brief moment before quietly saying something that no one inside Blackstone Keep had ever expected to hear. Thank you, Emily. Emily forgot how to breathe. The words were simple, spoken in a calm voice that carried neither ceremony nor distance, yet they settled gently inside the room with a weight no royal decree could match. Thank you. No one had prepared her for gratitude from a king. She blinked once, uncertain whether she had heard correctly. Your Majesty, she answered softly. You do not have to thank me. Kieran studied her expression. There was no pride in her eyes, no excitement over standing inside the royal study, and certainly no expectation of reward. She looked genuinely confused, as though kindness should never be acknowledged because it ought to exist naturally. That quiet belief stirred something unfamiliar within him. For years, every conversation around him had revolved around politics, alliances, military reports, and carefully measured words. Even compliments often carried hidden motives. Yet this young Omega had crossed an entire courtyard simply because she believed another person looked cold. Nothing more, nothing less. Kieran slowly removed the blanket from his shoulders and held it carefully in both hands. May I ask you something? Emily nodded. Of course. Who made this? Her eyes softened immediately. My grandmother, Margaret Carter. She raised me after my parents passed away when I was very young. During every winter, she collected leftover pieces of wool that merchants could not sell. She said every small piece still had warmth to give if someone was willing to sew them together. Kieran looked again at the uneven stitching surrounding the tiny crescent moon embroidered into one corner. Suddenly the blanket seemed far more valuable than any royal tapestry decorating the castle walls. She sounds wise. Emily smiled, though sadness quietly touched her eyes. She always believed gentle people should never apologize for staying gentle. The sentence lingered in the quiet room. Kieran found himself remembering his own childhood once again. His mother had often spoken in similar ways before illness had taken her years earlier. She had insisted that compassion was never weakness, even for future kings. After her passing, no one had repeated those lessons. Duty had replaced tenderness. Survival had replaced comfort. Somewhere along the way, he had stopped expecting warmth altogether. A soft knock interrupted the silence. Lord Victor Hawthorne entered carrying several leather folders filled with documents. He paused immediately after noticing Emily still standing inside the study. Surprise flickered briefly across his composed expression before he bowed respectfully. Your Majesty, the council members have assembled for the afternoon session. Kieran nodded, but made no movement toward the door. Victor glanced almost imperceptibly toward the blanket still resting in the king's hands. Shall I escort Miss Carter from the castle afterward? He asked carefully. Emily immediately lowered her head. That would be perfectly fine, Your Majesty. I have already taken far too much of your time. Kieran looked toward the snow-covered mountains beyond the window before speaking. No. The single word surprised both of them. Victor remained perfectly still. Emily lifted her eyes in confusion. Kieran turned back toward her. The roads to your village will become dangerous before sunset. The storm is growing stronger. Emily glanced outside. The snowfall had indeed become heavier, covering the stone pathways almost completely. She had walked nearly 6 miles that morning to deliver herbs. Returning alone through the mountain forest after dark would not be easy. There are guest rooms prepared for traveling healers. Kieran continued calmly. You may remain here tonight if you wish. You may leave safely tomorrow after breakfast. Emily stared at him in disbelief. Inside the castle? Yes. She instinctively shook her head. I could never impose like that. You are not imposing. His answer came gently, but without hesitation. You are our guest. Victor Hawthorne carefully concealed his astonishment behind years of practiced diplomacy. The Alpha King had hosted ambassadors, generals, and foreign rulers with formal courtesy, yet he had never personally invited an ordinary villager to remain inside Blackstone Keep. This decision would undoubtedly become the only topic discussed throughout the castle before sunset. Emily looked from Kieran to the enormous windows overlooking the mountains. She knew refusing repeated royal hospitality might appear disrespectful, yet accepting it felt almost impossible to imagine. If it truly is not a burden, she whispered. It is not. Kieran handed the folded blanket back toward her. Emily instinctively reached for it, but before their hands met he paused. Would you allow me to borrow it until morning? She blinked. Borrow it. He nodded once. Only for tonight. Emily smiled for the first time without nervousness. It was a small smile, quiet and sincere, but it carried enough warmth to soften the solemn atmosphere filling the room. Of course, Your Majesty. My grandmother also used to say that blankets only fulfill their purpose when they are keeping someone warm. Kieran returned the faintest hint of a smile, so subtle that anyone else might have missed it completely. Yet Lord Victor Hawthorne saw it clearly, and for the first time since entering royal service nearly 15 years earlier, he wondered whether the future of the Northern Territories had just begun changing because of the simplest gift anyone had ever offered its lonely king. Emily had never imagined that a castle could become quiet after sunset. As one of the palace attendants gently guided her through long stone corridors lit by warm lanterns, she expected endless noise from servants, nobles, and royal officials. Instead, Blackstone Keep seemed to breathe with calm dignity. The thick walls softened every sound until only the crackling fireplaces and the distant whisper of the winter wind remained. The young attendant, whose name was Clara Bennett, smiled kindly as she opened the door to a modest guest room overlooking the eastern gardens. This room is usually reserved for visiting healers, Clara explained. If you need anything at all, someone is always nearby. Emily stepped inside carefully, almost afraid to touch anything. A neatly made bed rested beside a stone fireplace where a gentle fire already glowed. Fresh towels had been folded with remarkable care. A small wooden table held warm vegetable soup, fresh bread, honey, and a steaming cup of herbal tea. The simple kindness nearly brought tears to Emily's eyes. This is far too much for me, she whispered. Clara shook her head with a soft laugh. His Majesty insisted that every guest should be treated with dignity. We simply follow his wishes. Emily looked down at her worn boots. I have never been called a guest inside a castle before. Clara noticed the sincerity in those words and quietly smiled before excusing herself, leaving Emily alone with the peaceful silence. Meanwhile, across the castle, Kieran remained inside his private chamber. The folded cream-colored blanket rested across the back of a wooden chair beside the fireplace. He had intended to return it before dinner, yet every time he reached for it, something persuaded him to leave it where it was. The room itself looked no different than it had the previous evening. Shelves filled with maps surrounded the stone walls. Reports from neighboring territories covered his desk. His silver crown rested untouched beside a stack of unfinished letters. Everything remained exactly as it had for years. Everything except the strange feeling of calm that refused to disappear. Kieran slowly approached the chair and picked up the blanket once more. The familiar scent of cedarwood and lavender lingered within the old fabric. It reminded him less of royalty and more of ordinary evenings spent beside warm fireplaces before responsibility had replaced childhood. He closed his eyes briefly, surprised that the endless tension he had carried for so many years seemed quieter tonight. A gentle knock interrupted his thoughts. Enter. Captain Rowan Mercer stepped inside and bowed respectfully. Your Majesty. What is it? Rowan hesitated, choosing his words carefully. The servants have noticed something unusual. Kieran raised an eyebrow. Go on. The palace wolves. Kieran waited. They have gathered outside the eastern guest wing. That answer immediately caught his attention. Every castle maintained trained wolves that served as loyal companions and guardians. They were intelligent, disciplined, and rarely abandoned their assigned patrol routes. How many? Kieran asked. All 6. Rowan continued calmly. None of them appear distressed. They are simply lying outside Miss Carter's room. Quietly, Kieran remained silent for several moments. Such behavior made no sense. Palace wolves recognized danger immediately. If they surrounded someone, it was usually because they sensed fear or hostility. Yet Rowan had specifically said they appeared peaceful. Has she noticed? No, Your Majesty. The attendants intentionally closed the curtains before nightfall. We did not wish to alarm her. Kieran walked toward the window overlooking the moonlit courtyard. Snow continued falling gently beneath a sky filled with stars. Do not disturb them, he finally said. Rowan nodded. As you wish. Before leaving, he paused near the doorway. There is something else. Kieran turned slightly. The wolves have never behaved this way before. Not even around members of the royal family. After Rowan departed, Kieran stood alone once again. His gaze drifted toward the folded blanket resting in his hands. Throughout his reign, people had often spoken about strength, authority, and destiny. Very few ever mentioned gentleness. Yet within a single afternoon, an ordinary village Omega had unknowingly accomplished what years of carefully constructed order never had. She had brought peace wherever she walked. Down the quiet hallway, Emily sat beside the fireplace wrapped in a borrowed robe, warming her hands around the cup of herbal tea. Outside her window, 6 enormous wolves rested silently beneath the falling snow. None of them growled. None of them paced. They simply remained there with calm eyes turned toward the room, as though standing in invisible watch through the long winter night. Emily noticed only one unusual thing before climbing into bed. For reasons she could not explain, despite sleeping inside the largest castle she had ever seen, surrounded by strangers she had met only hours before, she felt safer than she had in many years. And somewhere else beneath the same moonlit sky, the Alpha King looked toward the eastern wing of Blackstone Keep with quiet curiosity, unaware that the oldest instincts of his kingdom had already recognized something extraordinary long before either of them understood why. The following morning arrived wrapped in silver light, as fresh snow covered every rooftop of Blackstone Keep. Emily awoke slowly, almost forgetting where she was until the tall stone walls and glowing fireplace reminded her of the extraordinary day before. For a quiet moment, she simply listened. Instead of frightened whispers or hurried footsteps outside her door, she heard something unexpected. Gentle breathing. Curious, she wrapped a warm shawl around her shoulders and carefully pulled aside the heavy curtain covering the window. Her eyes widened immediately. 6 enormous wolves still rested peacefully beneath the snow-covered trees outside the eastern guest wing. Their thick coats shimmered beneath the pale morning sun, and although they clearly noticed her movement, none of them barked or growled. Instead, several slowly lifted their heads before calmly wagging their tails against the snow. Emily placed one hand over her heart. Good morning, she whispered through the glass without thinking. One of the oldest wolves blinked lazily before lowering its head once more, as though completely satisfied simply knowing she was awake. Emily smiled despite herself. She had always loved animals. Since childhood, injured birds, frightened rabbits, and abandoned dogs somehow found their way to her family's tiny cottage. Her grandmother used to laugh that creatures trusted Emily long before people ever learned to. She had never questioned it. To her, kindness felt easier than fear. After dressing, she quietly stepped into the hallway where Clara Bennett greeted her with a warm smile. Did you sleep well? Clara asked. Emily nodded. Better than I expected. Clara hesitated before speaking again. There is something rather unusual everyone is discussing this morning. Emily looked puzzled. What happened? Clara glanced around the empty corridor before lowering her voice. The palace wolves refused to leave this wing all night. Emily blinked. Really? Captain Mercer himself came twice to check on them. They simply remained outside your window until sunrise. Emily looked genuinely confused. Perhaps they liked the smell of the soup. Clara laughed softly, unable to help herself. I do not think anyone has ever explained royal wolves with vegetable soup. Together they walked toward the dining hall, completely unaware that far above them, several members of the royal council observed the courtyard through tall windows overlooking the eastern gardens. Lord Victor Hawthorne stood beside an elderly woman wearing deep blue robes embroidered with silver thread. Lady Eleanor Whitmore served as the kingdom's oldest historian, having devoted nearly 60 years to preserving forgotten traditions and ancient records. Her sharp gray eyes rested thoughtfully upon the wolves still gathered below. "You have seen this before," Victor said quietly. Eleanor remained silent for several moments. "Not in my lifetime," she finally answered. "Only in the oldest manuscripts." Victor turned toward her. "What do they say?" She looked toward the snowy gardens once more. "Long before our kingdom was united, the wolves were believed to recognize peaceful hearts before human eyes could. They often gathered around those whose kindness carried no selfish purpose." Victor folded his hands behind his back. "Legends? Perhaps." Eleanor smiled gently. "Most forgotten truths eventually become legends." Meanwhile, Kieran entered the council chamber carrying the familiar cream-colored blanket folded neatly over one arm. Conversations immediately stopped. Every advisor noticed it, though none dared comment directly. The king calmly took his seat before glancing toward the reports awaiting his attention. Yet despite the piles of official business surrounding him, his thoughts drifted unexpectedly toward the eastern guest wing. Rowan Mercer quietly approached his chair. "Your Majesty, any changes?" Kieran asked without looking up. Rowan understood immediately. The wolves have finally returned to their regular patrol routes after Miss Carter left her room. Several advisors exchanged discreet glances. Kieran nodded once before continuing his work. Yet Lord Victor noticed something almost imperceptible. The king's shoulders seemed less burdened than they had the previous morning. The constant weariness that usually surrounded him had softened ever so slightly. Across the castle, Emily entered the dining hall and nearly stopped walking altogether. A long table overflowing with fresh bread, fruit preserves, oatmeal, eggs, and warm cinnamon pastries stretched before her. She had never seen so much food prepared for breakfast. Unsure where to sit, she quietly chose the chair nearest the end of the table, hoping not to inconvenience anyone. Before she could even reach for a piece of bread, the hall doors opened once again. Every servant immediately bowed. Emily looked up in surprise as Kieran entered the room. He paused briefly after noticing her already seated before walking toward the opposite end of the enormous table. The distance between them remained considerable, yet for reasons neither fully understood, the room no longer felt quite so large. Emily offered a small respectful smile. Kieran returned a quiet nod. Around them, servants exchanged astonished glances while pretending to focus on pouring tea. None of them missed the simple fact that for the first time in many years, the Alpha King chose to eat breakfast in the Great Hall instead of alone inside his private study. And somewhere deep within Blackstone Keep, an old historian closed an ancient book with thoughtful hands, silently wondering whether the forgotten stories she had spent a lifetime protecting were beginning to awaken once again. Breakfast ended more quietly than Emily had expected. The servants moved with practiced grace, collecting dishes while nobles arriving for morning meetings cast discreet glances toward the young Omega, seated near the end of the enormous table. Emily noticed the curious looks, but chose not to dwell on them. She thanked every servant who refilled her tea, carried her empty plate to the serving station despite gentle protests, and apologized twice for crumbs that had fallen onto the tablecloth. Her small acts of courtesy did not go unnoticed. Clara Bennett watched with a smile that grew warmer by the minute. Most guests expected to be served. Emily seemed more concerned with making everyone else's work easier. After breakfast, Captain Rowan Mercer approached with his usual composed expression. "Miss Carter," he said respectfully, "His Majesty has asked whether you would care to see the royal gardens before your journey home. The roads remain icy, so the carriage will not depart until early afternoon." Emily's eyes brightened with genuine surprise. "I would love that, if it is truly allowed." Rowan nodded once. "Follow me." The royal gardens stretched across several acres behind Blackstone Keep, protected by ancient stone walls that sheltered evergreen trees, winding paths, and crystal ponds now resting beneath a blanket of snow. Even in winter the place carried quiet beauty. Frost shimmered upon bare branches while tiny birds hopped between snow-covered hedges searching for seeds. Emily walked slowly, taking in every detail with quiet wonder. She paused beside a weathered stone fountain shaped like two wolves looking toward the sky. "It is beautiful," she whispered. Rowan noticed how naturally she admired simple things. She spent several minutes watching a pair of sparrows rather than the expensive marble statues surrounding them. "Most visitors ask about the royal greenhouse," Rowan observed. Emily smiled. "These birds seem happier than flowers trapped behind glass." Before Rowan could answer, soft footsteps approached from another path. Lady Eleanor Whitmore carried a worn leather book tucked beneath one arm, her silver hair glowing beneath the winter sunlight. "Captain," she greeted warmly. Rowan bowed respectfully. "Lady Whitmore." Eleanor's gentle eyes settled upon Emily. "So this is the young lady everyone has been discussing." Emily immediately curtsied. "It is an honor to meet you." Eleanor smiled kindly. "The honor belongs to someone who reminded an old castle that warmth can arrive wearing ordinary boots." Emily's cheeks turned pink again. "I only shared my blanket." "Sometimes," Eleanor replied softly. "The smallest gifts reveal the greatest hearts." As they continued walking together, they arrived beneath an ancient cedar tree whose branches spread across nearly 50 feet of the garden. Its massive trunk had stood there for centuries, surviving every winter the kingdom could remember. Eleanor gently rested one hand against its rough bark. "This tree was planted when the first Alpha King built Blackstone Keep," she explained. "Many believe it remembers every generation." Emily stepped closer, admiring the deep lines running through the old wood. Without thinking, she lightly brushed away a heavy layer of snow weighing down one low branch. "There," she whispered almost playfully. "That should feel a little lighter." At that exact moment, something remarkable happened. A flock of white doves hidden among the upper branches suddenly lifted into the air together, circling gracefully above the garden before disappearing into the bright winter sky. Emily laughed softly in surprise. "I did not know they were there." Rowan looked upward thoughtfully. Eleanor remained completely still. The old historian's eyes drifted from the disappearing birds to the young Omega standing beside the ancient cedar. Slowly, she opened the worn leather book she carried and turned several fragile pages yellowed by time. One faded illustration caught her attention immediately. It depicted a great cedar tree surrounded by peaceful wolves and birds while a woman offered shelter beneath an ordinary woven blanket. Eleanor read the handwritten words beneath the drawing in complete silence. "When compassion asks for nothing, even the oldest guardians remember." She closed the book without another word. Emily noticed her thoughtful expression. "Is everything all right?" Eleanor smiled gently. "I believe I have just remembered something I had almost forgotten." Across the castle courtyard, Kieran stood alone on a second-floor balcony overlooking the gardens below. From that distance, he could not hear their conversation, but he watched Emily kneel near a tiny robin hopping uncertainly across the snow. She broke a small piece of bread from the roll she had carried from breakfast and placed it carefully on a nearby stone before quietly stepping back. The little bird tilted its head, then hopped forward without fear. Kieran found himself smiling almost unconsciously. Lord Victor Hawthorne stepped onto the balcony moments later carrying several official letters. He followed the king's gaze toward the gardens before speaking. "Your Majesty, the carriage can be prepared within the hour." Kieran remained silent for several seconds. The cream-colored blanket still rested folded neatly across one arm. Finally, he looked toward Victor and gave an unexpected instruction. "Delay the departure until tomorrow morning." Victor blinked. "May I ask the reason?" Kieran's eyes returned to the peaceful figure walking beneath the ancient cedar. "The storm has not finished passing." Victor glanced toward the perfectly clear winter sky where sunlight sparkled across untouched snow. Yet he asked no further questions. Somewhere deep inside, he suspected the weather had very little to do with the king's decision. The following morning dawned beneath a sky so clear that the mountains surrounding Blackstone Keep seemed close enough to touch. Fresh snow sparkled like scattered crystals beneath the rising sun, while the entire castle slowly awakened to another winter day. Emily stood beside the eastern gate with her small basket of herbs resting at her feet. Her worn traveling cloak had been brushed clean by Clara Bennett, and although she was grateful beyond words for every kindness shown to her, part of her believed it was finally time to return to the quiet village where her simple life belonged. Clara adjusted the edge of Emily's scarf with a warm smile. "Everyone is going to miss you." Emily laughed softly. "I only stayed 2 nights. Sometimes that is long enough." Before Emily could answer, The great bells above the castle entrance rang once, their deep voices echoing across the snowy courtyard. Guards immediately stepped aside while servants paused respectfully along the stone pathways. Emily turned in surprise as Kieran Ashford walked toward the gate, accompanied only by Captain Rowan Mercer and Lord Victor Hawthorne. There was no royal procession, no formal ceremony, and no grand announcement. The king simply approached with the same calm dignity that had first silenced the courtyard 2 days earlier. Yet this time something felt different. Fear no longer arrived before him. Curiosity had quietly taken its place. Kieran stopped a few feet away from Emily. Resting carefully across his arms was the familiar cream-colored blanket, folded with remarkable care. He looked at it for a brief moment before lifting his eyes to hers. "I believe this belongs to you." Emily accepted it gently, running her fingertips across the familiar stitches her grandmother had sewn so many years before. "Thank you, Your Majesty. I was beginning to think it preferred the castle." A faint smile appeared in Kieran's eyes. It reminded the castle of something it had forgotten. Emily looked at him with quiet confusion. Kieran continued before she could respond. "For many years, everyone here believed strength meant standing alone. You reminded us that sometimes strength begins when someone chooses to care." The words settled over the courtyard more quietly than the falling snow had on the day they first met. Servants lowered their eyes, not from fear this time, but from reflection. Even Lord Victor found himself unexpectedly moved by the simple honesty in the king's voice. Kieran stepped one pace closer and, to the astonishment of everyone watching, carefully unfolded the blanket once more. Before Emily realized what he intended, he gently placed it across her shoulders exactly as she had once placed it across his. Every movement remained respectful, patient, and filled with quiet gratitude. The old wool rested comfortably around her, warmed not by royal luxury, but by shared kindness. Emily looked down at the blanket before lifting tear-bright eyes toward him. "You did not have to do that." "Yes," Kieran answered softly. "I did." He looked briefly toward the gathered servants, guards, and advisors surrounding the courtyard before speaking clearly enough for all of them to hear. "The first person who saw the man before the crown deserves to be remembered for who she truly is." Silence followed once again, but it was no longer the heavy silence of fear. It was the peaceful silence that comes when people witness something genuine. Lady Eleanor Whitmore quietly closed the ancient book she carried beneath her arm. The oldest stories had always claimed that kingdoms changed through courage. She now believed they also changed through compassion. One by one, the palace wolves emerged from the snowy gardens and calmly approached the courtyard. They stopped several feet behind Emily, their tails wagging gently as morning sunlight reflected from their silver coats. None of them made a sound. They simply stood together as though acknowledging someone they had already accepted long before anyone else had. Emily smiled through quiet tears and reached down to stroke the head of the oldest wolf as it leaned gently toward her hand. "I will come back to visit," she whispered. Clara laughed softly. "I do not think you will have much choice anymore." Even Rowan Mercer allowed himself the smallest smile. The carriage soon rolled through the castle gates, carrying Emily back toward the village nestled beyond the snowy hills. She looked back only once. Kieran remained standing where she had left him, watching until the carriage disappeared beyond the winding road. He did not wave. He did not call her back. Yet for the first time in many years, Blackstone Keep no longer felt like a fortress built only of stone. It felt like a home waiting patiently for warmth to return. Emily wrapped her grandmother's blanket a little tighter around her shoulders and smiled at the winter landscape stretching endlessly ahead. She had arrived believing she had offered nothing more than a simple piece of cloth to someone standing in the cold. She left understanding that genuine kindness never becomes smaller when it is shared. Sometimes it quietly changes a lonely heart. Sometimes it changes an entire kingdom.